Hi everyone, my name is Crystal Stone, and today I'm going to spend a little more than 5 minutes just talking about Bessie Coleman, who is someone that I believe made a significant historical contribution. A significant contribution to moving African Americans and women rights forward, and was a very progressive person in history, although she is grossly understudied. So this is a picture of Bessie Coleman. You can guess what her profession was based on her attire. Bessie Coleman was born in 1892 in Atlanta, Texas, and that is correct. Not Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta, Texas. She was the 10th of 13 children in a family that was of African American and Cherokee Indian descent. So she's biracial. She's African American and Cherokee Indian, so Native American. She grew up during Jim Crow laws, so that's segregation, right? We've learned a lot about that in this class. And her family was extremely poor. I read that, she went to a school that was 4 miles away from her house, and from a very early age she had to walk. And she also had to leave school early to help her family with cotton picking. So, they weren't slaves. They made a very small amount of money to do this, but with cotton picking of all things. So, Bessie and her family joined something called the Great Migration and moved to Chicago when she was in her early 20s. And what the Great Migration was, it was a period in history when folks of color moved from the South to the North, where they felt like they would have more opportunity and be safer from some of the historical violence against people of color that was occurring in the South, due to deep-seated negative opinions about folks of color, and also just hatred, racism, and discrimination. In Chicago, she was a manicurist, so, if you like getting your nails done, that was what she did. And she was first drawn to aviation because she would listen to folks talk about the pilots in World War I, and she thought that was really fascinating. So then she started applying to aviation schools, but the schools that she applied for rejected her, and they rejected her simply on the basis of the fact that she was Black. Again, she's of Cherokee and African American descent, and she was a woman. So Bessie didn't allow herself to be held back by that. She taught herself French, which I think is super amazing. Fun fact, I'm someone who also has taught myself French, so I appreciate the dedication and the commitment that's involved with that. So she taught herself French, and in the early 1920s, the early 20s, she traveled to France. And she traveled there because women of color, or I should say women and people of color, just had fewer restrictions. So in terms of getting into aviation schools. So she trained there, and in June of 1921, she earned her international pilot's license, which is really amazing. She returned to the United States to be a pilot, and she did stunt shows. So I wanted to show you this. I thought this was really, really interesting. It's a flyer. It says Bessie Coleman. Hopefully you can see that. The race is only aviatrix, right? So this is one of the flyers for her show, which I thought was super cool. So yeah, she came back to the United States, and I will say that unfortunately her struggles, as I noted kind of in my paper, didn't end there though, right? So she had to deal with discrimination kind of twofold, right? She was a woman and she was a person of color, and this is a time where people of color are punched down, right? We learned that when we talked about Malcolm Gladwell a couple weeks ago, and we talked about kind of what happens with teachers back then. So same thing's happening here. And in addition to that, there were traditional roles that women were expected to hold, and flying a plane wasn't one of them. So aircrafts, so planes that were available to people of color, were often old. They were unsafe. And show organizers, so the people who put on these stunt shows, wanted people to perform for segregated audiences. So they were fine with Bessie Coleman doing cool tricks, but they wanted her to do them for white-only audiences. She actually fought back against that and was quoted as saying that she would not take part in any show that wasn't open to all of her people, which is a really powerful thing. This is something that she lost income over. This is something that she lost jobs over, but you know, she was a woman of faith. She grew up in a faith-based home. She was a woman of moral integrity, and she advocated for people of color and for women. So yeah, she refused to participate in segregated shows, which I think was really amazing. I think it's important for folks to study her in history right now for a couple of reasons. I think that, you know, first and foremost, she does a lot to kind of correct the narrative around aviation, right? So, you know, this was not something that was exclusive to white males, and I think that, you know, save for Amelia Earhart, white males are kind of highlighted in that history. I also think that, you know, kind of an interesting point as I was researching her and thinking about things, you know, I think it's important to note that advocacy, especially like, you know, self-advocacy, began before the 1950s, right? So, you know, we think of those prominent individuals like Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., people who, you know, everyone knows about from a very, very young age as individuals who stood up for themselves and for their fellow people of color. And I think cases like Bessie Coleman show us that those acts of advocacy and self worth and determination and African Americans, young African Americans, having other people look like them that were doing these amazing things. All of that was happening long before Martin Luther King Jr. and some of these other things. So I think that kind of helps to formulate like a timeline of Black people and women really advocating for themselves, and it shows how long it took to sort of get where we are, you know, and we're certainly not perfect and where we want to be necessarily, but it really speaks to, you know, 50 years before all of this, or 30 years before, you know, some of the bigger named folks we study in history. This was a fight that African Americans, Native Americans, and women were having, especially those who were discriminated against from a dual standpoint, right? So I think that's really important. I think that ultimately, by including Bessie Coleman and individuals like her in U.S. history courses, we just honor a more complete narrative of America. You know, we're acknowledging all of our innovators, we're confronting injustice, and we're celebrating people who dared to imagine a different future. And, you know, that's something that I say in my paper because I feel very strongly about that. This is someone who, unfortunately, and she passed away very young. She was 34 years old, and I think, you know, I'm 39 now, and gosh, that's so young. And she actually passed away in a plane crash, and she'd bought a plane, and her family was very concerned about the safety because, again, historically, African Americans were forced to fly planes that were deemed unsafe, and she had a stunt to do, and her plan was to jump out of the plane in a parachute anyway. So she made the choice to, you know, get in that plane, and it did a nosedive kind of unexpectedly, where she was thrown out of the plane before she could launch her parachute and was killed very tragically and instantly. And then the other pilot that was with her died upon impact. So this is a young woman who died doing what she loved, died advocating for the rights of, you know, people like me to dream and to do bigger things. And I just think that she's someone that we should think about and we should study in the future. So thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you guys. I've enjoyed the class. Take good care. Bye.